Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. Imagine your new neighbor. A rich guy in a glass mansion decides your priceless century-old trees are blocking his view. You tell him no, so he waits until you're out of town and secretly cuts them all down. He thought it was over, but I had a security camera and a lawyer who knew all about treble damages. I bought my dream property 5 years ago. 3 acres in a semi-rural area about 40 minutes outside the city. The land had been in the same family for generations before we bought it, and one of the best features was the row of 5 massive oak trees along the eastern property line. According to the previous owner, they were well over 100 years old. These weren't just trees, they were living monuments. The trunks were so wide my wife and I couldn't join hands around them. The canopy provided this incredible dappled shade across half our backyard. Our 2 kids, ages 7 and 9 at the time, could play in the yard without baking in the summer sun, and the trees gave us complete privacy from the neighboring lot. That neighboring lot was empty when we moved in. Just 3 acres of overgrown grass and scrub brush. It had been for sale for years, according to our realtor, but the price was steep and the land wasn't particularly desirable. No utilities run to it, uneven terrain, nothing special about it except the location. We liked having the buffer. Our kids could run around, we could have bonfires, and we didn't have to worry about anyone complaining or watching. That changed 3 years ago when someone finally bought the lot next door. The first sign of trouble was when the bulldozers showed up. I'm not against development, I get it, people buy land to build on it, but what went up next door was something else entirely. The new owner, I'll call him Richard, not his real name, built what I can only describe as an architectural statement piece. All glass and steel, ultra-modern, the kind of house you'd see in a magazine spread about minimalist design. It probably cost close to $1 million. Beautiful craftsmanship, I'll give him that. But here's the thing, his fancy glass house had this whole wall of windows facing our direction, and he'd specifically oriented the house to look out toward the hills in the distance. Except the trees were in the way. I didn't meet Richard until after his house was finished. He came over one Saturday afternoon while I was working in the garage. Mid-40s, expensive watch, driving a Tesla. Friendly enough at first. Introduced himself, made small talk about the neighborhood, complimented our property. Then he got to the point. "Those oak trees on the property line," he said, gesturing toward them. "They're really overgrown. Have you thought about trimming them back?" I looked at the trees. They weren't overgrown. They were mature oaks, perfectly healthy, doing exactly what oak trees do. "They're pretty well maintained," I said. "We had an arborist out last year to check them. They're in great shape." "Right, but they're blocking the view from my house," he said, like this was a problem I should naturally want to solve for him. "I was thinking if you trimmed them back, maybe 10 or 15 feet, it would open things up. I'd be happy to split the cost with you." I tried to be diplomatic. "I appreciate the offer, but we really love those trees the way they are. They provide shade for the kids' play set and privacy for both our properties." His smile tightened a bit. "Privacy from what?" "We're neighbors, and I have to say those trees really diminish the value of my property. I paid a lot of money for that view." "I understand," I said, but the trees were here long before either of our houses. They're on the property line. Actually, the surveyor said they're technically about 2 feet onto our side, so there are trees." He wasn't happy about that. "Well, think about it," he said. "I'm sure we can work something out." I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Over the next few months, Richard became increasingly persistent. He'd catch me outside and bring up the trees. "Still thinking about that trimming?" He'd mention how much his view was worth. He'd talk about how the trees dropped leaves and acorns on his driveway. Once he tried to suggest that the trees were a hazard because they could fall on his house during a storm. Never mind that they were 100 years old and had survived every storm nature could throw at them, or that his house was a good 50 feet away from the trees. I stayed polite but firm. No, we weren't cutting the trees. No, we weren't interested in compromising by topping them. No, we didn't want to discuss it further. That's when the harassment started. First, we got a notice from the county about our property being in violation of some obscure ordinance about yard maintenance. An inspector came out, looked around, found nothing wrong, and left. The inspector told me someone had filed a complaint. When I asked who, he said complaints were anonymous, but he'd note in his report that the property was well maintained. 2 weeks later, another notice, this time about our chicken coop being too close to the property line. I pulled out the county regulations and our original building permit. The coop was exactly where it was supposed to be, with 5 feet to spare. Another inspector visit, another cleared complaint. Then it was our kids' wooden play set being a permanent structure that required permits. Then it was our compost bin being a nuisance. Then it was our dog barking. We don't have a dog. Each complaint required time to deal with, inspectors coming out, paperwork to file, stress for my wife who worked from home and had to stop what she was doing to meet with county officials. I knew it was Richard. Who else would it be? But I couldn't prove it, and the complaints were anonymous. My wife wanted to confront him. I told her to wait. I thought eventually he'd give up. The trees weren't going anywhere, and he'd just have to accept that. Then came the weekend that changed everything. We'd planned a trip to visit my wife's parents about 3 hours away. We left Friday afternoon right after the kids got out of school and planned to come back Sunday evening. It was early October, perfect weather, and I remember thinking as we drove away how beautiful the property looked with the oak trees just starting to turn color. We got back Sunday around 6 in the evening. The kids were tired from the drive, and I was looking forward to getting them into bed and relaxing. I pulled into the driveway, got out to help unload the car, and happened to glance toward the backyard. Something was wrong. The light looked different, too bright, too open. I walked around the side of the house and stopped dead. All 5 of those magnificent 100-year-old oak trees had been cut down to stumps barely 3 feet high. I just stood there. I couldn't process what I was seeing. My wife came around the corner and gasped. The kids ran up asking what was wrong and then went quiet when they saw. Where there had been towering oaks with sprawling canopies, there were just stumps. The ground was covered in sawdust and wood chips. Branches had been stacked in piles. Someone had done this with professional equipment. The cuts were clean, the debris was organized. This wasn't vandalism. This was a professional tree removal job, and beyond the stumps clearly visible now was Richard's glass house. The neighbor's precious view was now completely unobstructed. I felt sick. Then I felt furious. Then I felt sick again. I told my wife to take the kids inside. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and called the police. An officer came out within 20 minutes. He walked around the stumps with me, took photos, and wrote everything down in his report. He said it was definitely criminal property destruction, but without witnesses or evidence pointing to who did it, there wasn't much they could do immediately. He said to gather any evidence I could find, security footage, witnesses, anything, and call back. He also suggested talking to a lawyer since the monetary damages would likely be significant even aside from any criminal charges. After the officer left, I walked over to Richard's house. I was trying to stay calm, but I'm not sure I managed it. He answered the door with this expression, not quite a smile, but close, like he was trying not to look too pleased with himself. "Did you cut down my trees?" I asked. "Your trees?" He raised his eyebrows. "I think you mean the trees on the property line." And no, I didn't cut them down. But I did notice someone was doing tree work in the area yesterday. Shame about the mess they left. "You hired someone to cut down my trees while I was gone." "That's a serious accusation," he said. "Do you have any proof?" I didn't. Not yet. But I was going to find it. "Those trees were over 100 years old," I said. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I haven't done anything," he said. "But hypothetically, if someone removed some overgrown trees that were diminishing their property value and blocking their legally purchased view, I'd say they were within their rights. Have a good evening." He shut the door. I stood there on his porch for a moment, trying not to lose it completely. Then I went home and started making calls. First, I called a real estate attorney I'd worked with when we bought the property. He listened to everything and said I needed to document every detail immediately. Take photos from every angle. Measure the stumps. Don't let anyone remove any evidence. Then he gave me the name of a litigation attorney who specialized in property disputes. I spent the rest of the evening taking photos. My wife helped. We measured the stumps, photographed the cut marks, documented the piles of branches and debris. The kids kept asking when we could get new trees. I didn't know how to explain that you can't just replace a 100-year-old tree. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about how those trees had been there when my grandparents were kids. How they'd survived droughts and storms and diseases only to be cut down in a few hours because some guy wanted a better view for his $1 million house. Monday morning I called the litigation attorney. His name was Michael, and he agreed to meet with me that afternoon. I brought all the photos, the police report, the property survey, and a list of everything I could remember about Richard's harassment campaign. Michael listened carefully, taking notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "This is a strong case," he said. "The trees were clearly on your property. Cutting them down without permission is trespassing, property destruction, and several other things we can pursue. But here's what makes this especially interesting. Your state has very specific laws about trees. If someone illegally destroys your trees, you can sue for what's called treble damages." "What does that mean?" I asked. "Basically, whatever the trees are worth, they owe you 3 times that amount," he explained. It's meant to discourage exactly this kind of behavior. People see a tree and think, it's just a tree. How much could it be worth? But old-growth trees are valuable, very valuable, and when you triple that, how valuable are we talking? I asked. We'll need an arborist to do a formal appraisal, but based on what you've described, 5 mature oak trees over 100 years old, healthy and well-maintained, we could be looking at anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 in tree value. Triple that, and you're looking at a significant lawsuit. I felt a grim satisfaction hearing that. What do we need to do? First, we need to prove your neighbor did this, Michael said. Do you have any security cameras? I'd installed security cameras around our property about a year earlier. We had one covering the driveway, one at the front door, and one on the back corner of the house covering the deck area because we'd had issues with raccoons getting into our trash. That back camera had a wide-angle view that caught most of the backyard, including the tree line. I hadn't thought to check the footage immediately because I'd been so upset. But when Michael asked, I remembered. I might, I said. Let me check the footage when I get home. That evening, I pulled up the security camera app on my laptop. The back camera had caught everything. Saturday morning around 8, a truck with tree service equipment pulled up to Richard's house. 3 men got out. Richard met them outside and walked them over to the property line. The footage was clear enough that I could see him pointing at the trees and gesturing. They talked for maybe 10 minutes. At one point, Richard took out his phone, probably showing them something. Then the crew got to work. The footage showed them setting up equipment, cutting down the first tree, then the second. Richard came back several times throughout the day to check on the progress. In one clip, he was clearly standing on our property, right next to one of the stumps, inspecting the work. By late afternoon, all 5 trees were down. The crew cleaned up, loaded their equipment, and left. Richard stood there for a while afterward, looking out toward his view, clearly satisfied. I had him. I sent the footage to Michael the next morning. He called me back within an hour. This is perfect, he said. Your neighbor is on camera directing the tree service, standing on your property next to the stumps, clearly involved in the whole operation. We can absolutely use this. I'm going to send a formal demand letter to him today. We're going to request immediate compensation for the trees plus all associated damages. If he doesn't respond appropriately, we'll file a lawsuit. What about the tree service, I asked. Are they liable too? Possibly, but I want to investigate that angle before we decide. Sometimes the tree service is an innocent party who was lied to. Sometimes they're complicit. Let me look into it. Michael sent the demand letter that day. It detailed the destruction of the trees, cited the relevant property laws, included screenshots from the security footage, and demanded Richard pay for a full arborist assessment plus compensation for the trees. The letter gave him 7 days to respond. Richard responded through a lawyer. His position was that the trees were on the property line, they weren't, that they were a hazard, they weren't, and that he had the right to maintain vegetation that affected his property, he didn't. His lawyer's letter was full of bluster and legal threats, but it basically boiled down to, we're not paying anything. Michael filed the lawsuit 2 weeks later. Meanwhile, I hired a consulting arborist to assess the damage. He was professional and knowledgeable. I explained the situation, sent him the photos. He said his schedule was packed, but given the nature of the case, someone else had destroyed the evidence and we needed documentation quickly. He'd come out within 3 days. He showed up 2 days later. He spent almost 4 hours on the property, examining the stumps, measuring them, taking core samples, photographing everything from multiple angles and documenting the species, health, and approximate age of the trees. When he finished, he sat down with me and went through his preliminary findings. These were exceptional specimens, he said. Old-growth white oak, all 5 of them healthy and well-maintained. Based on the growth rings in the stumps, I'd estimate they were between 120 and 140 years old. Trees like this are irreplaceable. You can plant new trees, but it'll be over a century before they're anything like what you had. What are they worth? I asked. I'll need to complete my full report with all the calculations, but conservatively, I'd estimate between $70,000 and $90,000 for all 5 trees combined. The replacement value is actually higher, but we use industry standard formulas that account for species, size, health, location, and other factors. And with treble damages, that would be $210,000 to $270,000, he said, plus your legal fees, the cost of my assessment, and any other associated damages. I just sat there processing that number. Richard had cut down my trees to get a view, and it was going to cost him $250,000. The arborist's full report came a week later. His final valuation was $84,000 for the 5 trees. With treble damages, that meant $252,000 just for the trees themselves. The lawsuit moved forward. During discovery, we subpoenaed records from the tree service. Turns out they were a small operation from 2 counties over. The neighbor had told them he owned both properties and was clearing land. They'd asked about permits, and he showed them some county paperwork. Later, we found out it was just his own building permits, nothing to do with tree removal. The crew had taken standard before and after photos for their records and kept the invoice showing the neighbor paid them nearly $8,000. When they realized what had actually happened, they were furious with him for putting them in legal jeopardy. They cooperated fully with our legal team. Richard's defense fell apart pretty quickly. The security footage was damning. The tree service records proved he'd hired and paid them. The property survey showed the trees were on our land. The arborist's report established their value. His own lawyer probably told him he was going to lose, and lose badly. About 16 months after we filed the lawsuit, after multiple depositions and with a trial date finally set, Richard's lawyer contacted ours about settlement discussions. I'll spare you the back-and-forth negotiation details, but we eventually settled for $247,000. That covered the treble damages for the trees, our legal fees, the arborist's costs, and compensation for the harassment campaign we'd documented. Richard's homeowner's insurance refused to cover any of it because it was an intentional act, so he had to pay out of pocket. He put his house on the market 3 weeks after the settlement went through. The house that probably cost him close to $1 million to build sold for significantly less. Turns out the value of that view he'd been so obsessed with wasn't as impressive to buyers as he'd thought, especially with our property now clearly visible where the trees had been. He took a substantial loss. The people who bought the house seem nice. They're a young family, friendly, respectful. I met the husband during their final walkthrough, and he asked me about the property line and mentioned he'd heard there was a dispute with the previous owner. I gave him the short version. He was shocked anyone would do something so stupid. He mentioned the previous owner had seemed pretty bitter during the closing process, and now he understood why. We used part of the settlement money to plant new trees, different varieties spread across the property, including several along that eastern property line. They'll take decades to mature, but that's okay. We also finally built the fence we'd been talking about for years. 8 feet tall, solid wood, running the entire length of the property line on our side. Completely legal, completely within our rights, and completely blocking any view from Richard's old house. The new owners didn't seem to mind the fence. In fact, they mentioned they appreciated the privacy. I drive past that eastern property line every day now. Where there used to be 100-year-old oaks, there are young trees, still thin and small, struggling to establish themselves. It makes me angry every time I see it. Not because of the money, we got compensation for that, but because you can't replace time. Those trees took over a century to grow, and they're gone because one guy couldn't handle not having a perfect view from his living room. But here's the thing. Richard paid for those trees 3 times over, lost his house, and ended up staring at an 8-foot fence that he essentially paid for through the settlement. He wanted a view so badly he was willing to break the law to get it. Instead, he got a lawsuit, a massive financial loss, and had to leave with nothing to show for it but an expensive lesson about property rights and tree law. My kids ask sometimes when the new trees will be big enough to climb. I tell them maybe when their kids are grown. It's a long time to wait, but some things can't be rushed. Looking back, his whole plan backfired in the most spectacular way possible. He destroyed the trees to get his view and ended up forced to sell at a loss, leaving behind an 8-foot fence blocking everything he'd wanted to see. Sometimes karma has a sense of humor. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Backstory, I will not bore you with a bunch of technical jargon. I will try to keep it simple. I worked as a manager at a gas station, although the company had more or less trapped me in that position. Before becoming a manager, I was the person they called whenever a store across state lines was short-staffed or needed help with paperwork and employee training. I was a staff lead and had been placed on track to eventually move into the information technology department. Then another company bought us out. At the time, I was essentially doing the work of an assistant manager, except I did not handle the money. That changed when I was promoted. The store they assigned me to was losing money. Management had seen me turn around another location while it had no manager, and the district manager was handling the finances, so they moved me to this struggling store and spent a lot of time talking up the benefits of the position. I accepted. I am not pretending to be some kind of technical genius, but I had spent years developing Linux tools in my spare time. I also had a side job repairing computers and occasionally building complete systems from parts customers had ordered. I would not describe myself as a senior systems administrator, but I was definitely not a beginner either. I also document everything. That becomes important later, becoming the unofficial information technology department. I eventually settled into the routine of managing the store. Paperwork, the safe, bank deposits, schedules, and everything else. At first, some weeks ended in profit and others ended in losses. After a couple of years, I finally got the store consistently operating in the black. The biggest ongoing problem was the equipment. The gas pumps, server, registers, office computer, and other systems were not ancient, but they were clearly showing their age. We had to defragment the office computer more than once. The card readers regularly stopped working. The server would occasionally decide it was done cooperating for the day. Software updates would break the registers and pumps would throw basic input-output system errors. There were plenty of other problems too. At the center of everything was a system they called the Commander. It essentially controlled every device in the store. Whenever something broke, we had to submit an information technology ticket. The department then prioritized stores based on which location had the worst problem. There were 2 technicians responsible for about 30 stores. Sometimes it took weeks for one of them to visit. I did not like waiting that long, so I started fixing problems myself. To be fair, the technicians had insurance requirements and many other concerns to deal with, but their response times were terrible, and my store could not afford to sit around with essential equipment out of service. If the server went down, I fixed it. If the office computer stopped working, I fixed it. If the registers started throwing errors, I fixed them. If the soda machine broke, I fixed it. Whatever problem came up, I found a way to get the equipment working again. The most common issue involved the card readers. They were powered on constantly, so most of the time they simply needed to be reset. You could not just replace one with another unit either, which I discovered after trying. On that particular day, the real issue was that the register had stopped communicating with the reader. I never disassembled any of this equipment. These were temporary fixes that kept the store running despite the larger underlying problems. One day, the company sent me to train a new manager at another store. My district manager was going to cover my location while I was away. You might wonder why the district manager did not train the new manager herself. There were several district managers and the store was outside her assigned area. To preserve the proper chain of command, management decided sending me was the better option. The company had recently purchased several new stores and their employees needed to learn our operating structure. I did not mind. Spending more than 70 hours every week staring at the same walls becomes exhausting, so the change of scenery was welcome. While I was at the other store, I received a call from my location, then another, then another. The card readers, registers, and gas pumps had all stopped working. I immediately knew what the problem was. Whenever those 3 systems failed at the same time, the commander had frozen. When that happened, the entire system stopped allowing card transactions. I explained what to do. They reset the commander and everything started working again. The compliance. About 2 weeks later, I received an email from the person in charge of both information technology and maintenance. He said that from then on, I had to submit the proper request form whenever anything needed to be repaired. I replied that if I submitted a form and nobody came quickly enough, the store would lose money. He responded, and I am not exaggerating, "You do not understand how complex these systems are. Any fix you perform could damage them." That comment irritated me. I did not understand the systems. I was the person who had been keeping them functional while repeatedly asking the company to replace its outdated equipment. Fine, I told him I would comply. From that point forward, every problem generated a request. Card reader not working, submit a form to information technology, register down, submit a form, soda machine broken, submit a maintenance request. The requests piled up very quickly. Eventually, whenever a technician finally visited my store, they had multiple issues waiting for them. My district manager asked why I had stopped fixing things myself. I showed her the email and explained what I had been instructed to do. She was furious, but the person controlling the information technology and maintenance departments outranked her. She could not order me to ignore his instructions and resume fixing the equipment. The review. About 4 months later, we had a manager's meeting where everyone received a performance review. It was essentially an opportunity for corporate management to tell us what we were doing wrong and decide whether we deserved raises. They told me my performance was poor. They said I had allowed the store to deteriorate and needed to improve several areas. I stopped them immediately. I had arrived prepared because, as I mentioned earlier, I document everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. I showed them records demonstrating that sales improved when I personally kept the equipment working. I gave them my notes documenting exactly when different machines had failed. I explained that some of my paperwork had been submitted late because I sometimes had to wait for the computer system to function for 5 uninterrupted minutes before I could even email it. I showed them the email instructing me to stop making repairs and submit request forms instead. Then I showed them how sales had fallen after I began following that instruction. I told them they could not give me a poor review for complying with a written order from someone above me. That was when my district manager spoke up. She explained that I had originally been placed on the fast track to join the information technology department. However, after the recent buyout, I had been removed from that track because the new parent company already had a much larger information technology staff. That new staff had not taken over yet because the acquisition was recent, and integrating all the stores would take time. So I had lost the career opportunity I had been working toward, but I was still expected to keep the failing equipment operational without officially being allowed to touch it. The Aftermath management had to hold several meetings after that. They had to discuss my review, why I had been removed from the information technology track, and how the ongoing buyout affected the entire situation. Unfortunately, around that same time, my body began failing me. Working more than 70 hours a week while dealing with a bad back, damaged knees, and several other health problems was not sustainable. I eventually reached the point where I could not stand for long periods, and I even blacked out at work. I had to quit. Before leaving, I created a handwritten notebook containing instructions for every piece of equipment and every temporary fix I had discovered. I wrote it by hand because storing it on a company computer felt risky. I did not want anyone accessing it early, deleting it, or altering it. The notebook contained error codes, descriptions of what different failures looked like, their most likely causes, and the steps I used to restore each system. It was a masterpiece of documentation. I submitted my 2 weeks' notice and left. A few days later, someone called asking about the notebook. I told them where I had left it, they found it, used it, and everything seemed fine. Later, I heard through the grapevine that when the new company finally took control of my old store, its staff saw the condition of the equipment and found my notebook. The new owner eventually heard the full story. Apparently, he was angry about how everything had been handled. He said that talent developed through years of solving real problems in the trenches was valuable. Eventually, the company replaced the outdated equipment. I heard it cost them thousands of dollars. It was not enough to seriously damage the company, but it was enough to make someone's pockets feel considerably lighter. These days, I work from home. I still develop Linux tools, and have released some publicly. I have also started writing and working with content creators. I do not earn as much as I did at the gas station, but my life is peaceful. I no longer have to fight an outdated computer system every day while management blames me for keeping it alive. The moral of the story is simple. Do not blame the person who is desperately trying to keep the ship afloat. The next one is an entitled people story. The guy from Shark Tank, Kevin, is building a new AI data center in the Utah desert that is planned to about double the power consumption of the entire state with just his one project. Enter State Senate President Stuart Adams, bonus story at the bottom, longest-serving Senate president in the state's history. His support was instrumental in getting the project going with state financial and other support. The locals and people statewide were opposed, but he charged ahead anyway. Becoming the first sitting Senate president to lose in a primary election, he declared that his data center support cost him the election, but the only thing he would do differently was demand the state explain why they were forcing it down everybody's throat. 2 Box Elder County commissioners who supported the 40,000-acre project also turned the primary from what is usually a formality into inglorious defeats. Maybe the new data center's AI can help them figure out why. Bonus story. Stewart's 18-year-old granddaughter was charged with a rather severe penalty for having sex with a 13-year-old and was facing 50 years in prison. Being responsible and ethical, Stewart recused himself from any legislative action related to the charges. He did, however, call his friend the Senate Majority Leader and had a friendly conversation about how harsh and unfair this law was. 18-year-olds who have sex with 13-year-olds should be treated just as leniently as 17-year-olds. The Majority Leader called up the granddaughter's lawyer and asked how the law would have to be altered in order to cut her some slack, then promptly passed that bill. To ensure that nobody could claim the bill was passed to benefit her, they made it not retroactive so it wouldn't benefit her. Then the DA said, I know this law change doesn't technically apply, but the will of the state legislature has been made clear, and turned a mandatory 25 to life with mandatory sex offender registration into 8 days in jail, 517 days of house arrest with an ankle monitor, 4 years of probation, a $1,500 fine, and no sex offender registration. Oh, Utah. Anyway, thank you for watching.